Okay, so hopefully Deja will join us before her presentation begins. And Westree, how's Westree doing?
He's right beside me.
Okay, great. All right. So let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad that you are here to join us today for ECSU's 2021 Undergraduate Research Week. My name is Dr. Melissa Stuckey, and I am one of the professors in the Department of Social Sciences and the History Program. And today we are so excited to present to you our students and their work in African-American cemetery preservation at Old Oak Grove Cemetery here in Elizabeth City. This presentation is coming out of about a year's worth of work, a year and a half even, thinking about starting September of 2019, well before COVID, where we were approached by the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, which is part of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, about putting on an African American cemetery preservation workshop. That workshop was initially scheduled for March of 2020. You can imagine that we had to cancel it and regroup. So we did that starting in the fall of 2020 and decided to switch things up a little bit to make it happen with COVID-friendly kind of practices. So we made it a little bit smaller in terms of the number of participants who would be active on the ground. And we also obviously put the workshop online. So we decided to do during Black History Month, a conference, a mini conference that was a 2-day event. The first day being a cleaning workshop featuring experts from different departments of the North Carolina Department of Natural Cultural Resources, including Melissa Timo, who is in the Office of State Archaeology, Jessica Kosmas, who is at the Museum of the Albemarle, and Angela Thornton, who is director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. In addition, we enjoyed the expertise of my colleague in the history department or the history program, Dr. Latif Tariq. So that all took place in February, and our hope was to be able to go out the very next day after learning all kinds of important techniques about how to preserve through cleaning African-American headstones from African-American cemeteries. We had to postpone that because if you remember January, February, and early March, it was nonstop rain. And one thing that we don't want to do is go into a cemetery after so much rain or in the middle of so much rain, because we don't want to cause any more damage to the cemetery with our footprint. And our cemetery, as you'll learn through these student presentations, is a very fragile one that is right behind it is a creek. And if you know northeastern North Carolina, we are really part of the Great Dismal Swamp watershed. So we're talking swampy land. So we needed to wait for some dry days. We finally got those dry days at the end of March. And as you see, the history faculty listed here, myself, Dr. Tariq, and Dr. Chaz Reed went out to Old Oak Grove Cemetery with our students who are presenting today. Those students are Barry Ward, Aaron Wrighton, Westree Thorpe, and Deja Fisher. And we also had a special guest, Dr. Latif's daughter also joined us, and also Jessica Kosmas from the Museum of the Albemarle. So we had a small group. We went out, we evaluated the cemetery, we evaluated the headstones, and then we practiced some of the work that we'd learned how to do in that workshop in terms of cleaning headstones. So with that introduction, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Aaron Wrighton, who is a senior history major with a concentration in digital and public history. His favorite subjects were similar to mine when I was an undergraduate too. So European history before the 20th century, history of religion. And Aaron is hoping to move into policy analysis or journalism after graduation. And I think his activities, of which he's only listed one, but there are many that lend himself to being really ripe for that kind of policy analyst work. In particular is his work in the 2020 election as a volunteer or participant in the Campus Vote Project, which helped to recruit poll workers and promote the Campus Vote Project as an organization. And poll workers are such an incredibly important resource for protecting voting rights and just ensuring that there is an orderly and safe election, which we absolutely had in 2020. Just going to note that. So Mr. Aaron Wrighton, here you go.
Okay. Now let's first talk about the importance of Old Oak Grove Cemetery. First of all, it's an African-American cemetery that was created during around the time of segregation. But it serves as an important piece of the reality and the history of African-Americans in this region of North Carolina. I mean, there are plenty of people who are war veterans. There are people who have fought in the Civil War. There are people dating back to the founding of ECSU who are buried there. There's a lot of history in Old Oak Grove that ties back to this entire region. It serves as a monument to the public memory of African Americans in this region of the world. That's why it should be preserved. That's why it is important. That's why it serves as something unique and indispensable for the public memory of African Americans in our life and our culture in this area. Next slide. All right. And Oak Grove has a history with it that is, like I said earlier, very well tied to Elizabeth City State University. First of all, Hugh Kell, among many others, were among the people to buy the land in the first place that they used to make the cemetery. And the cemetery was purchased with the purpose of having an area that colored people in Pasco-Tate County could use for whatever purpose they saw fit. And they saw fit to make it a cemetery for Black people, African-American people in this particular area. Next slide. Now, here's a little bit of more of the connection between Elizabeth City State University and Oak Grove Cemetery. As I said earlier, there are prominent members that are important to the founding of the school that are buried there. Hugh Kell, who was essentially the founder of Elizabeth City State University, is buried there. P.W. Moore, who was the first principal, or what we would consider a chancellor now, is also buried there. And let's not also forget that Hugh Kell, as I said earlier, is one of the ones who founded, it was one of the ones who are responsible for the creation of this cemetery in the first place. Next slide. Now, cemetery conditions, the landscape. Now, one of the first things that I noticed when we first arrived to the cemetery is the fact that a lot of the gravestones and headstones are very packed together. There's not much space between individual graves for you to actually go through and see. As you can see right here in the picture, there are pieces that are separated, different plots, but within each of those plots, the graves are squished together. You barely can go across or see any particular grave while potentially stepping over one or stepping on one. Next slide. And this stands in straight contrast when you compare it to other graves that are not too far away. They're not too far away from Oak Grove Cemetery. For example, New Hollywood Cemetery, as you can clearly see in the image on the right here, there's a bunch of different segments for people to be able to drive to or travel to be able to see individual graves or different family plots or whatever is there. And comparing this to Oak Grove, you can clearly see the difference, and more care is taken with New Hollywood to make sure you can go through these different areas and you can see these different plots without having to worry about stepping over graves or interfering with graves, because you can just drive right through there. While Oak Grove, every step is almost stepping on a grave. Next slide. And as Ms. Stuckey, Dr. Stuckey, my bad, as she mentioned earlier in the year, there was a lot of rain. And this is something that's a great example of the detriment to the cemetery. is because the way the land is shaped, the geography of the land itself, and the fact that it's located right beside Charles Creek means that this land is very prone to flooding. Water takes a long time to dissipate on this ground, and the excessive amount of water that it retains makes the land more marshy than it should be. And this excessive water, this excessive flooding erodes some of the placement of these headstones or grave sites and can cause them to be shifted or moved or torn over. And in water, enough water can cause actual damage to these headstones in the cemetery in of itself. Next slide. Here are some more examples of like flooding within the cemetery. As you can see, there's a pool of water pooling up right on top of somebody's grave. And this picture to the left is an example of when we walked through there earlier, and almost every step was like muddy. And if you're going through a cemetery trying to visit loved ones or just trying to assess the whole entire thing, and every step you make is muddy and you can almost trip or fall or slip, it is not an ideal piece of land that you want to have someone that you love buried at, especially when you cannot easily go through it or access it. Next slide. There's also issues with overgrown vegetation. There's plenty of areas within Oak Grove where vegetation seems to be growing over on top of graves and over headstones. This is a gigantic problem because, first of all, a lot of these headstones are flat stones or go amiss. People cannot tell that they're there or that they were there. It seems that vegetation has grown so much over some of these that it's almost you cannot even tell that it was a gravesite. This picture right here, for example, there are multiple. It's like a family plot. There are multiple graves here. Some you can't even see that are further under the tree, or a bush, as you will, which tells me that this was planted here before, but it got out of control, and there was nobody here to stop it from growing this far. And that's a big problem, especially when it comes to people trying to find out who's buried here. People who have family who's buried here, and they cannot even see them or know where they are, or they dismiss it because it's covering it so much. It seems like nothing's even there. Next slide. Here are some more examples of that very thing. As you can see in the left one, this grave has almost been completely covered over by plants and grass and other plant life. It almost seems as if give it a little bit more time, and this grave probably will be completely covered, and it would not have been able to tell that it was even a grave there to start with. The same thing for the picture on the right. As you can see, this grave has almost been completely taken over. And the same thing for the one a little bit to the left in that picture. There's no way to tell who was there. The name is probably covered with plants. You have to dig and take those apart to even be able to tell who was there or who the grave even belonged to. And that's a real big issue when it comes to people looking for who's buried here. I repeated it before because it's such an important part that I need to drive home. When things like this are allowed to happen, it makes people not realize that there are graves there, and they get dismissed. They get put out of sight, out of mind, and it was as if they were never even there. Next slide. Now, there's also an issue of human damage or human error when it comes to the damages that this gravesite, this cemetery, has been burdened with. For example, there's lawnmower damage, or possibly people who are recklessly driving who have knocked over headstones and left marks over people's graves and headstones, as you can see right here in this picture. This headstone has been completely misplaced and taken out of its rightful order and been knocked completely over. Next slide. Same thing for this one here. Now, this one has to have been there for a while. It's been broken, it's been run over, and to some extent, you can even see vegetation growing over it. And this one's highly noticeable, which begs the question, why has it not been picked up, put back, or have anything done with it? It looks as if someone ran over it multiple times. Next slide. Now, headstones are, there's a bunch of different issues as far as headstones are concerned at Oak Grove Cemetery. Some have been eroded, some have been cracked, some have been broken, as you saw before on the human damage slide. Some have been pushed out of its place or removed. Some have faced a great discoloration thanks to erosion, either by water or other chemicals or other natural elements that the headstones face, depending on what type of material the headstone is, whether it's marble, cement, or whatever type. It has its own situation when it comes to erosion and discoloration. Next slide. These are a few more examples of the conditions the headstones are in. As you can see on the far left, this one's been completely pushed out and a little bit broken. As you can see, the one in the middle is completely cracked about near the bottom. It's as if it's about to fall completely apart. And the one on the far right is not only is it shifted in its place, but it's also have been greatly discolored. And because of this, you can barely make out the name or who it belonged to thanks to this discoloration. Next slide. Now, this also goes in tandem with human damage, but it seems to be trash over the cemetery. There was trash found, especially near the very back of the cemetery, near where the creek is. And that could be because when it rains or when there's flooding, the creek will rise and sometimes bring trash with it. But it's also trash in areas of the cemetery where there's no way it could have been caused purely by the creek. There's trash there that seems to be new. There's trash there that seems to be put there, just thrown there by other people. And that's a huge problem when it comes to maintaining the neatness, not only the neatness, when it just comes to maintaining the gravesite just in general. You cannot have trash swirled everywhere. You cannot have people throw trash anywhere. And there's logistics to be figured out when it comes to solving that particular issue. But it's something of note that needs to be done, something needs to be done about, or it needs to be stopped.
Aaron, thank you so much. Just listening to your presentation reminds me of, we're deep in the weeds sometimes, but just the overview reminds me of how very important the work that we've begun embarking on. And, we're building off of work that other people have done as well. So thank you so much for your presentation. If you have questions for Aaron, you can put them in the chat and we'll do questions at the very end. Next up, we have Westree Thorpe, who I think is sitting right next to Aaron. And he is going to give us a conversation about headstones as a source of public memory and an analysis of the headstones in Old Oak Grove Cemetery. So Westree is also a senior history major, also in education with a minor, the science of coaching. So we can get a sense of what his intentions are right there. His favorite topics are African history and African and diasporic history and modern wars, with a future career path as a teacher. So we're really proud of him following in the tradition of great teachers. Westree, take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Stuckey. I want to go into what is public memory. A definition that I found was public memory refers to the way that a group of people, usually a nation of people or an ethnic group, remembers and or highlights how their history. This can be interpreted in a very large amount of ways, but usually is interpreted by traditions or monuments. The most common form of monument are headstones. Next slide. As I said, headstones are the most common form of monuments. Oak Grove was established as a burial ground for African Americans in Elizabeth City, as it was a segregated graveyard. This particularly holds a number of USCT veterans. At least 60 veterans are buried at Overgrown Grove, but also our Elizabeth City State's founders, Hugh Cale, P.W. Moore, and John Henry Bias. Next slide. The acronym USCT stands for the United States Colored Troops. This term was given to African-American soldiers during the Civil War. By many people, it is seen as a precursor to the Buffalo Soldiers. They were not permitted to join the Army officially until 1862, but also many served anyway under the books. It was also a thing where a number of women served as spies, and later on, it composed more than 10% of the Union Army. I also have a quote from Abraham Lincoln. "Without the military help of the Black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won." Next slide. Jesse Agerson, this is someone who is buried there. We found some stuff about him, that he was 5'3". He was the age of 22 when he enlisted, and he was with Company H of the 14th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops, Heavy Artillery. Next slide. This was the headstone, was Sergeant Randall Evans. This is the headstone I cleaned. Randall Evans was a sergeant of the 14th Regiment, and he led Company A and was also heavy artillery. Next slide. This is the condition that many of the USCT headstones are in today. As you can see, marble is very uniform with military headstones. Most are together in rows of two. As the pictures will show, many of them are knocked over. Some are leaning. There are cracks and chips in all of them. Some have been cleaned, most have been cleaned in 2010 with an unknown method, which led to sugaring. Next slide. This was the impact of me cleaning Sergeant Evans' headstone of March 27th, and 20 days later, April 7th. Next slide. Other headstone damage. There are cracked and broken headstones. Some have been damaged by failed repair attempts. Next slide. More headstone damage is also sinking headstones and raised vaults due to a number of things, mainly flooding. Next slide. More unknown graves. This is a picture of 4 graves, 4 ledger stones, and vegetation is starting to grow over them. Next slide. Here's another example of vegetation as the headstone is no longer legible. You could kind of see that the name is probably something with maybe Walker. It says World War I veteran, and much of else is not able to be made out. Next slide. Discoloration in the headstones. The first name has been completely eroded, and there's discoloration. Next slide. This is a comparison of old Hollywood. As you can see, there are large, grandiose headstones. They're all taken well care of, and the names are kept legible. Next slide. Next slide.
So this is your work cited, and so we can just take a quick look at those, some of the materials that Westree used. There are some links there to some really great and useful websites. Thank you so much, Westree Thorpe. Again, just like I said with Aaron, it's just really somber and sober for us to really think about this. So thank you so much for your efforts. Next, we're going to have a presentation on cleaning headstones featuring Barry Ward. Barry is a junior, so we get to have him next year. We're excited about that. And he is obviously a history major with a concentration in digital and public history. He's doing a minor in social studies. Barry's favorite topic is the Cold War era. And his hope is to enter a career in military contract work. And it excites me that our students are thinking about different career paths, because we're really proud of the fact that history is such a versatile degree. So Barry, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Stuckey. Hello, everyone that's here. My name is Barry Ward, and my job, as Dr. Stuckey already mentioned, I was in charge of discovering and detailing the cleaning of headstones. Overgrown Cemetery has a lot of headstone issues, as Westree said. A bunch of them deal with staining, vegetation, and a bunch of decoloration, and it's a long and hard process of cleaning them. The cemetery has location issues. It's located between a highway and a housing complex, so it's less noticeable as a cemetery. That's from personal experience. When I was riding over there to join everyone and take care of the headstones, I could not find the location. It took me a minute. The terrain damage is also very noticeable here. You can see work vehicles have damaged the roads and other things outside the cemetery. It looks good, but when you start to go inside, it just becomes more poor. The details are terrible, and it's something that needs to be paid attention to. And also, since it is located near Dismal Swamp or in the back where there's a marsh, flooding is regularly occurs, which will damage headstones, and it makes it harder to clean the headstone. Next slide, please. Vegetation issues were spotted all over the cemetery, and these two pictures only scratched the surface. There were signs of headstones being uprooted from the ground by the surrounding vegetation. There were more pictures I had. There were too many put on this PowerPoint. And many of the graves here, such as these two, are neglected and will continue to be neglected unless people such as ourselves make a change and make it noted. Next slide, please. Terrain erosion is also a problem. The ground level is uneven. As you can see on the left picture, the ground level starts to slowly slope downwards towards the marsh, which makes the headstones and the grave markers uneven, which could possibly uproot them from the ground. And then on the right side, you can't even really read the headstone, much make out what it is. You can see December of 1944 or 1942. Other than that, that's the only thing legible in my eyes. And it also has Charles Creek behind it as well, which also makes it flood. Next slide, please. Headstone cleaning, know before you go. You do not want to clean these headstones without being knowledgeable, because you could possibly and permanently damage these headstones, which will never be able to be fixed. It's a very long and grueling process. It takes time, patience. You need to be knowledgeable, and you need to seek expert advice. The results are not immediate, and if you would like to learn more about it, consult with the Office of State Archaeology. Next slide, please. There are plenty of materials needed for this long and grueling process. One such material is known as D2 solution, which is a chemical used to remove stains, lichens, and mosses, and other forms of bacteria off of these headstones so they will be legible. It can be harmful to the body, so wear gloves as a precaution. Many people wear goggles. I myself did not wear goggles that day, so I personally advise you to wear goggles. They will spray. Water is also used for diluting the D2 solution and is used to rinse the headstone. You will need plenty of water. As you can see, we have multiple gallons of water. Sponges are used for scrubbing the headstone, while toothbrushes and popsicle sticks will be used for the engraving, such as wording, dates, whatever. Because the sponge will not be able to get inside those tiny cracks, and you will need those popsicle sticks and toothbrushes to do so. Also, if you're cleaning engravings with a popsicle stick, you would want to snap it in half and use the rigid edges from the snap popsicle stick to get in the tiny details of the headstone. Protective wear will be necessary to stop any harmful effects of D2 to the body. And something to recommend, which I did not bring and I regret it, was a pillow, towel, or blanket, something to sit on because you will be out there for a while. Next slide, please. The cleaning process begins by rinsing the headstone off with water. You will want to rinse it off from a top to bottom motion to avoid streaking. Streaking is hard to get rid of if it is left up there for a long period of time. Then after you apply the water, you will want to apply the D2 solution, same as applying soap to a washcloth. It will be used to cleanse the headstone and remove any of the lichens, mosses, and stains on the headstone. There will be multiple applications for this. As said in the slide, you'll rinse again and repeat. But remember, same as everything else in the process, you want to apply it from top to bottom. After you apply the D2 solution and begin to scrub, apply water again. You will apply the water again to rinse off part of the D2, which this will also build a lather on the headstone and the sponge, same as if you're cleaning a car. Then you will begin to scrub gently with the sponge or popsicle stick or toothpicks, or not toothpicks, toothbrushes. And this will help remove any and all damages off the headstone. But again, I must make clear it will take time. After you do all that, you rinse again and repeat the process until you are satisfied with your work. And then you will come back several weeks later and see how much you've made, how much progress you've made. Next slide, please. Last week on Thursday, I went to 3 cemeteries to have a cemetery comparison of their headstones and to see how well the maintenance was on them. This is an example of Oak Grove. You can see the staining up there is clear. There are no clear signs of words on the headstone, and many of the other older headstones such as these are in need of dire repair or they need to be taken care of. And they are also all enclosed together, which means there's crowding. As Aaron said before, there's no room to walk and you feel like you're personally stepping on someone's grave, which is a terrible feeling. Next slide, please. An example of this is my truck in the background. This is Westlawn Cemetery. When I first saw this picture, I believe that building in the back was used as dormitories, used bathrooms, or any other things. And I went up to there and took a picture, and it was a mausoleum. There were multiple caskets inside, and there were steeples inside, or there were church benches inside. There's about four by 2, and there was plenty of room to sit. And it was used, I think it would be used as a church hall. It's in great condition. The vegetation is clearly under control in this picture. And from that building and the headstones shown in this picture as well, there's proper maintenance. It's clear and it's evident that this cemetery, Westlawn Cemetery, which is off of Main Street Extended, is well kept and taken into consideration. Next slide, please. The second graveyard I went to visit, the cemetery I went to visit, was New Hollywood, which is in the middle of town. It's on the same street as Old Oak Grove. The condition there was very good. It was very good. The headstones were legible. These 2 headstones right here are from military service members. Melvin Mayo Hooker Sr., and I believe that is Felix Thurk. They were both World War II veterans. And if you compare those to the headstones, as Aaron did, and Wes at Old Oak Grove, the condition is made clear. There's clearly more care put into these headstones than one at Old Oak Grove. And no matter what their purpose serves, these headstones are important and they should be properly taken care of. And if they aren't, it clearly shows a lack of consideration for African-American history in Elizabeth City and Pasquotank County area. The vegetation is under control, maintenance is proper, but just as Old Oak Grove, this cemetery does deal with crowding. The cemetery is very crowded and there are very minimal places to walk. However, the roads in which you drive are well kept and they're clear, and you can clearly see where you're going to drive without thinking that you're going to hit something in the middle of the road. Next slide, please. And this is the comparison of the 2 headstones I witnessed. The one on the left is the one I personally cleaned. That is his name. His name would be Jerry Lamb, Sergeant. He's part of Company F of the 35th United States Colored Troops. This was my first time cleaning a headstone, so I did not expect amazing results, but I think what I've done so far, where you could see Jerry, that was all still stained and it was illegible. I feel like I personally did a good job for my first time, and I recommend anyone else who wants to go out there for a first time, try it. But before you do, please be knowledgeable. You do not want to damage these important pieces of history, especially because they impact the importance of Elizabeth City State University and the Pasquotank County area. And the ones on the right again are from New Hollywood Cemetery, both World War II veterans, and their headstones are in perfect condition. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you so very much, Barry. And I really appreciate that so many of you went out to take looks at other cemeteries to do a comparison. I think it's really important and eye-opening to do comparisons because it really does indicate the needs for Old Oak Grove in order so that this resource, this important burial space is here in another 100 years. So thank you so much for your efforts, Barry.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Last we have, and definitely not least, we have Miss Deja Fisher, who is also a senior. Her concentrations are race, gender, and ethnicity with a minor in Africana studies. Her favorite era is the civil rights era, and her interests for a future career path include museum education. Deja has also really expressed a particular interest in cemetery preservation, and I could see her doing this kind of work in the future as well. Deja, take it over.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Stuckey. My name is Deja Fisher, like Dr. Stuckey introduced me, and I'm going to be talking about African-American cemeteries and public policy. So I'll be going over state policy, local policy, slightly federal policy, and what can we do. Next slide, please. Okay, what is public policy? Public policy is a course of governmental action established to address the problems of the society at large, rather than individual needs on a smaller scale. So for example, public policy might tackle the problem of student loans by creating a student loan forgiveness program that affects several students at once rather than paying off the loan of one student. Something important to remember about public policy is that it does not just refer to the government's action, but also to the behaviors and actions that result from those actions. Next slide, please. Okay, why do we need African American cemetery policy? Simply for protection, record keeping, and maintenance. Okay. What policy exists? So for the policies that we found was North Carolina state policy, Elizabeth City local ordinances, but unfortunately there is no federal policy. Next slide. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the North Carolina Cemetery Act that was founded in 1975. Okay, so that act basically maintains cemetery records and receipts. It requires cemetery trustees and trust funds for the care and maintenance of cemeteries and the burial without regard to race or color. Next slide, please. Okay, so the current state policy, this was 2013. And this can be found in the Archaeology NCDCR website. These list penalties for defacing and destroying grave sites and for plowing over and covering up graves. And unfortunately, we did see this at Old Oak Grove Cemetery. Numerous headstones had been, I don't even want to say they look like they had been tipped, but they look like they had been destroyed. Definitely we saw where workers might have been digging new graves and just carelessly rolled over with their trucks and everything. We could see where it had been damaged, headstones have been broken. The policy also goes over trust funds for cemetery maintenance that may be established as a $5,000 minimum. 30 days public notice before moving the graves and written notice to the next of kin if it's known. Unmarked burials or distributed graves must be reported to county medical examiner or the state archaeologist immediately, or you can be fined. Next. Okay, local policy for the Elizabeth City Cemetery Code. This was first passed in 1975 alongside with the NC Cemetery Act. And if you did notice, that is 200 years after the nation's was founded. So I feel like that's a coincidence. It was revised in 2008 pre-registration by funeral homes of who will be buried at a specific plot. The city has requested funeral homes provide copies of records detailing all known burials and plots purchased for future burials, including bills of sale. So you have to have your receipts, of course. And that came from the Daily Advance. It was proposed again in 2013-14 for revisions. Pre-registration of burials 48 hours in advance. So if you don't have it within 48 hours, you will not be able to bury that person, which is unfortunate, but that's was revised. New restrictions on gravesite decorations. So for example, they had to put a restriction on what people could actually decorate these headstones with, because some people were going a little bit above and beyond trying to decorate and pay homage. Some people had brought out a bed, like a full-size bed, to a headstone, and I thought that was really, I'd never heard of that, but they definitely had to put restrictions. But of course, like artificial flowers, real flowers are always okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we need? I believe we need federal laws protecting African American cemeteries. We need to put knowledge into the community. We need to educate the community on the importance of African American cemeteries, informal, local, like what we're doing at ECSU with these days where we go out and clean headstones, something simple like that, that can go a very long way. And we also need funding, of course. Definitely have to put money into it so we can grow and better ourselves in these cemetery actions. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Deja. That's your last slide. There's one thing that I wanted to note that I think we missed adding one of your slides, and that is that 1975 North Carolina Cemetery Act expired in what, 2015? Is that right?
2015, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so that expired in 2015. And that is when the new state code that Deja went over was added in. And it took away that 1975 to 2015 code was long. It was very, very long, and there were lots of laws. So that was distilled down to a handful that are in our current code. And then I think that we were just both really surprised at the fact that there not only is there no federal laws protecting African American cemeteries, but there continues to be activism around them. So that's important. So I want to open up the floor to questions from our participants. I didn't notice any in the chat, but I'll defer to Dr. Tariq in that. And also you can feel free to open up your microphones and ask questions directly if you want to.
Yes, I do have two questions, and I actually answered them directly back to the participants, but I'm going to read the questions for the sake of the panel and the rest of the public. So Deborah Taylor Gonzalez Garcia, she asked, does the cemetery have a present day owner, or is it considered abandoned? So the city of Elizabeth City owns the cemetery. It is certainly not abandoned. We was actually out there during the day we was there was actually a burial. The cemetery overall doesn't look that bad. We're just keying in on areas that actually needs to be improved. For me, I think it may be a matter of the best department in the city for the cemetery, because I think right now you have to go through parks and recs for burial services, and I'm not quite sure what other city offices may be attached to the cemetery. I'm not sure if Dr. Stuckey may know of any other offices that may help to mandate the cemetery. Melissa Polcott, she has several questions. All right, so when was Oak Grove founded? I believe Oak Grove was founded in 1886. I answered who owns it now, the city of Elizabeth City. It is an active cemetery. How long is the cemetery? So the cemetery is roughly, I would estimate, at least about 2 football field size, with probably a little bit more added space to that. The size of the cemetery, I don't think is so much is a problem as it may be structure in terms of how close the roads may be to the burial sites itself. The very older graves, which is on the back of the brush that you can't see, but certainly there are graves there when you walk through that brush, and the rising creek actually affect that grave. Other issues such as trash. Some of the trash flows into the cemetery due to the rise of the creek, and then other aspects of the trash come into the cemetery because the cemetery is so close to the road, and plus a housing development which has a sidewalk for people to walk down, which causes for them to may litter. Are there any public volunteers cleanup days? Originally, this is what this conference and workshop was designed to do. So originally we were going to have a 2-day conference. The first day was going to be face-to-face on Elizabeth City State Campus, and the second day was going to be the community headstone cleaning. And we wanted to do that to try to promote the public to take self-interest in a old African-American cemetery / burial ground is what I call it, right? Are there any descendants involved? We definitely want the descendants within Elizabeth City to get involved, as well as the churches and fraternal organizations as well, to maybe adopt the cemetery or days of cleanup. That would be very helpful. So I'm going to check the chat for any more questions. And I do not see any more questions right now.
So Dr. Tariq, I see one from Aaron Holloway, who asks, thanks for your presentations. Does the cemetery have records? So Deja and I were just having a deep conversation about this. So I want her to chime in as well with additional thoughts. One of the things that we noted was that the new laws were about establishing requirements for records. So if you peel that layer back one, the records are spotty. There was no requirement for so many years to have like a systematic database of records, either on the local or county level or on the state level. So the 1975 laws were designed to correct that. Okay, so I've got a question for all of our scholars, and I'm going to have each one of you respond, and I'll call you out. So just get ready. I'll do it in the order that you're presented. What would you say that your number one, maybe number 1 or 2 takeaways were with your research in your experience? What would you say to folks who want to do this? And well, so first, how did you feel about doing this? What did you learn? What's your takeaway? And what would you say to folks who want to do this with you? Aaron.
Well, first of all, how I felt about it, I know most people are going to be like, it's a gravesite, it's a graveyard. I don't really want to go dig in the graveyard, dead bodies. But I think for me, what I take away from this is that when there's a situation involving something so important, especially dealing with people in graves or cemeteries where people's loved ones are buried, where people's grandparents are buried, where people have an invested interest in the actual history in the place, that is something that you should take seriously, and that you should do what you can to try and get it fixed or something done if it's not being taken care of in its best condition. I've learned, I can't say that I've learned like a great deal of anything in particular that I didn't already necessarily have. But I've learned the importance of keeping cemeteries up to date and keeping cemeteries kept up. And anybody who wants to do something like this, if you want to do something like this, you need to care about it more than anything. To be honest, this is something that that is heavily you need to want it done. You need to want you need to think in your head that this is important. That what you are doing right now is something that is good, morally good, and that needs to be done.
I love that. Thank you so much, Aaron. Yeah, as Melissa Pocock says, great points, Aaron. So Westree, what did you learn? What did you take out of this? And what would you say to others who might be interested?
What did I take away from it? I took away, like, even though like it's a graveyard and it's like the people that there are dead, like they still like deserve respect, like even in death, like, I just had a thought and I lost it.
What would you say to others who might want to do this?
I'd be like, hey, at least go out there and know what you're doing. Don't be reckless, and don't be afraid to do it. Like graveyards have like this negative aura around them, but this is what it was. I was gonna say, it's like I felt good doing it, because it's like it's literally the opposite of desecrating a grave.
Yeah, I love that. So Barry, what did you learn? What did you get out of this experience? And what would you recommend to others?
When I first showed up that Saturday to go survey the graveyard, I was not looking forward to it because, as both Aaron and Wes have said, graveyards have an eerie aura. You feel like I don't belong here. It has negative energy. And when I started looking around, I started realizing that that place was a cry for help. It wanted help, and no one had answered it until now. And I believe that as the community of Elizabeth City State University, having people directly connected to university there, we should work together to fix this place. And that's what I learned from it, is that was a cry for help.
Thank you so much, Barry. So finally, Deja, what did you get out of this experience, and what might you say to others who are interested?
So if anyone is interested, I say definitely do it, but you have to be genuine about it. It's not just something for the aesthetic. Like, you have to know how important this is. Like, it's really up to us, like people in the land of the living, to keep in touch. And do we have to take care of the ones that have gone on in transition? Like, that's really important. And I feel like it's my part, especially in African American history, because we know how we weren't, how we weren't really taken care of or preserved, or even, I really don't know what to say, but I just know that it's really important, like, to get into it and to help it make a better, like, resting place. It's really a respect thing when you think about it. Like, I know if I had my ancestors out there at that gravesite, my heart would be like torn into a million pieces. Just the conditions that they were like laying in. That's not a restful, peaceful place that I think of. When you think of rest in peace, I didn't think of that. So I'm like, okay, now it's my job. I'm here, I'm breathing. I can take care of this place as long as I can. So if that's what I have to do, then I will. So it was really touching more than anything.
The four of you really have, you've emphasized how important public history is with your work. So I really want to thank you for making the extra effort to come out to the cemetery, not just once, but multiple times. Some of you spend hours there learning and hours there doing with your work. And that is the work of public history. We have a public history, a digital and public history minor at ECSU. So I'm super proud of those of us who are, part of the program. A few of I see at least one question in the chat that asks about plans to create a website or social media focused on this work. And I promise you that our chief digital and public history scholars, Dr. Tariq and Dr. Reed, along with me and the other professors in history, Dr. Bowman and Dr. Wong, that is something that I cannot imagine won't be happening. It was very clear to me as we started the very first part of this conference back in February that this was a beginning and not an end. So we only brought out a handful of students this time, and it was, we did one headstone apiece, right? So there's 8 of us, there's one headstone apiece done. There's so much work to do. And I think that there's a lot of will and desire in the community. So we are, proud to be of service to the community through the university to bring some, early education and to continue that process. And also to help to, continue the work of organizing. I think that we all recognize how important this is as a resource. I was contacted by the city just on Friday. They are applying for a grant to do surveying work at Old Oak Grove. And I promise you that we could not have done this work without the city. We could not have gotten into the cemetery and done what we did without their support. So there is will, and I think it's about finding a way, and that's what we do in public history, and that's definitely what we do at ECSU. I want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you for your questions. If there are questions that we did not get a chance to answer, I think the chat will be saved, so we'll be able to go through those and get back to you. If you want to put your contact information in the chat as well, or to private message Dr. Tariq or myself with it, that would be great too. That way, if when we do our next steps, we can let you know. With that being said, I want to thank everyone again for being here. Thank you to our students. Thank you to my colleagues. And before everyone departs, if you could turn on your cameras and we'll take a group picture of all the participants. Thank you so much. And it's also just nice to see your faces because I haven't been able to see everybody. So Aaron, if you want to turn your camera on, there we go. And is Barry still there with you?
I wasn't there with him, it was Wes.
I'm sorry, Westree, not Barry. I knew that. Y'all have to squeeze in a little closer. I know, but roll your chair up a little closer. Okay, so I think that is all the folks who want to be in the picture. And I'm gonna take it on 3. Or maybe I should take it on Viking Pride. Let's do that. Viking Pride. I guess I need to turn my camera on, sorry. Yay, there's me. All right. Viking Pride. And we'll do one more. Viking Pride. Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everybody. You have a great afternoon. Take good care.
Thanks, guys.